who was a language poet, and then I wanted to expand it to look at all the publication works of Emily Dickinson's work. And then when I started getting into that road, I realized that the public posthumous publication of Emily Dickinson was a total hot mess. And so if my paper is a hot mess, I'm still working on reconciling all of the emendations that's been done on Emily Dickinson's work. But I'm going to start with an anecdote. J.C. Squire, in a review of further poems of Emily Dickinson in the London Observer, once said, "It is probable, considering how widely she read, that she might, had she lived, have remodeled her poems and tried to give them a more conventional form. We may be glad she didn't. They are a direct message from mind and heart to mind and heart, and we can hear her voice in them." End quote. Emily Dickinson's posthumous publication followed a saga of editorial custody drama that critic Betsy Arkilla likens to the stuff of the American soap opera. From the separation of manuscripts between the Todd and Dickinson houses to its current ownership between the Houghton Library at Harvard and the Library of Amherst College, the battle is never ending. Presently, as editors continue to discern Dickinson's intentions, each impose distinct methods of reading her poetry, mainly through the application of editorial interferences that reflect culturally dominant structures. For example, Todd Higginson's palatable sells Dickinson's persona as a solitary recluse, all while disfiguring her poems by enforcing grammatical punctuations, wording corrections, and subcategorizations into artificial genres of life, love, nature, time, and eternity. The more modern editor, Thomas H. Johnson's Verorium, is filled with Dickinson's poetic effusions that includes her word and textual variances. However, he fits her poetry into the 1950s style of formalism new criticism. As a result, Arkilla signals that, quote, Dickinson's publication history is a scene of struggle, from the hands of seemingly adulterous, referencing Mabel Loomis Todd's affair with her Emily's brother, Austin, mutilating or otherwise inadequate editors, end quote. R.W. Franklin, a contemporary Dickinson editor and scholar, warns of the challenges facing authorial and textual studies of Emily Dickinson's poetry as a result of the editorial emendations that mar, silence, and or marginalize the author's voice. Quote, "As Miss Emily Dickinson came to be an object of study by the professional student of literature, well-known scholars and critics lamented the restrictions imposed by the published condition of her poems." End quote. His book, The Editing of Emily Dickinson, studies the effects of editorial impositions, beginning with Colonel Higginson and Mabel Loomis Todd, who both agreed to prepare, and the worst thing that they could have done was untangle the fascicles, and now we can never really know how Emily Dickinson positioned her poems prior to this emendation, per Lavinia's request, all the way to Johnson's Verorium. Franklin's work exposed textual alterations that reconsiders, as noted in his subtitle, A Reconsideration, interpretations of Emily's poetic genius. Miss Todd routinely copied the poems, but in so doing, quote, transcribed, eliminated, with spelling corrected, many capitals, omitted, and most of the punctuation regularized or otherwise changed, end quote. Colonel Higginson is better known for the classification of the poems, which I referenced earlier, but he also forced titles such as Numen Lumen and a couple other Latin-sounding names that were not provided by the author. Finally, Johnson's editorial choices reflect the challenges Todd and Higginson encountered, but Franklin pushes this to question the method of modern republication that even the printer fails to copy Dickinson's original manuscript. Franklin notes that, quote, "The Verorium is not an exact representation because the printing itself is a misrepresentation of the text as they exist in the manuscript," end quote. Ultimately, editors of Emily Dickinson's works are challenged with translation, as they must render comprehensible what otherwise is a compounding of, quote, "the poet's unconventional handwriting and individual mode of punctuation," end quote, that can really only be interpreted, say, based on Emily's sizing or her terms. In moving the conversation of editorial choices as being a challenging vocation, if not terribly doing the work that eradicates or revises authorial intent, Susan Howe, a feminist critic, a language poet, and a great admirer of Emily Dickinson, articulates that, quote, "Editing is the art of discipline, the mastery of detail," end quote. As a language poet, Howe proposes to return to the original manuscript and fascicles as the proper format to reading Emily Dickinson. In doing so, readers can visualize the random mark of communication written on the margins of a page, such as, quote, the cancellations, the variants, insertions, erasures, marginal notes, stray marks, and blanks, end quote, that Dickinson abundantly used in her writing. According to Howe, Dickinson took all the parts of a paper to demonstrate her conscious and unconscious separation from a mainstream literary orthodoxy. In so stating, Howe unapologetically sees previous emendations of Dickinson's work, quote, as an aesthetic defamation and a hostile and repressive political act of Dickinson's works. However, Howe notes that editing is a sensible partitioning, end quote, a process that adheres to some type of formal rules that must partition one's work, which foreshadows these gaps, erasures, and canonical strategies that must be inflicted to formulate a comprehensible interpretation of any literary works. Following Howe's work, I invite readers to consider that while editorial interferences ease a reader's perception, the posthumous publication of Dickinson's work references an Anglo-American form centrism, or lack thereof, that ignores social and cultural tensions, that exclusively limits the full potential for exploration of Dickinson's poetic genius. By recognizing these challenges that shape editorial interpretations may be the next step toward a more inclusive, if not pragmatic reading of Dickinson's poetry that doesn't silence the author's voice. Susan Howe's fascination with Dickinson's poetry is grounded on the basis of the female antinomian struggle, which Howe defines as, quote, a contradiction between conclusions that seem equally logical, reasonable, correct, sealed, natural, and necessary. She wrote that without any punctuations at all, hence my reading it really, really fast to show the effect of not amending someone's work. In her book, The Birthmark, Howe reveals her point of connection to Emily Dickinson is through her identification of Dickinson as an antinomian. She says, quote, Emily Dickinson's writing is my strength and my, I wrote that in, so I have no idea what word that is. But anyway, the antinomian struggle became an issue of exclusion when practices of new rhetorical styles was restricted to anybody contrary to male Anglo-centric figures. Joan Richardson notes that the antinomian crisis began when the rhetorical distortions masterfully deployed by John Cotton were taken up and extended experientially by Anne Hutchinson to explore those psychological conditions which made John Cotton's words effective. Women had been as influential as men, yet amid the wealth of new idealisms of the New World came a male resistance to change. John Cotton was a Calvinist preacher tasked with bringing moral religious order in a growing lawlessness in the new settlement as the Puritans came to the States. Since Hutchinson was a woman, her execution of Cotton's rhetoric was dismissed as, quote, free play, a distortion perceived as a threat to the body politic, end quote, since she lacked the male-centric canonic language and familiarity within the containing forms of argument. One can only visit now the spirit of Hutchinson through secondary sources. For Howe, she wanted to hear Hutchinson's voice, and voices I am following led me to the margins. The quest to follow primary sources and literary voices propelled Howe to recall her literary conquest within the barriers of marginalization. Her father once told her that, quote, it would be trespassing if I went into the stacks to find books, end quote. But trespass she did. Later, Howe found kinship in Emily Dickinson's works, whose unique poetic poems she defended from being silenced by editorial choices that basically imprisoned them into, quote, recognizable quatrains reminiscent of Protestant hymns, end quote. Howe argues that Dickinson's literary deviations allows for her very own dissenting critique of the bourgeois patriarchal culture. And that claim can also be supported by borrowing Dickinson's famous anti-publication poem, Publication is the Auction of the Mind of Man. With that said, Howe uses her expertise as a language poet to assert that only the true copying of a text can reveal an author's intended result, including ambiguity as an effect, as is the case with most of Dickinson's poetry. If we look at this poem, which I'm going to go over in a little bit, Howe notes that line breaks, word choosing and positioning, and unconventional writing techniques establish unique and specific effects. An exemplar can be seen in Howe's untitled poem beginning with As If All History Were a Progress. Read within the context of the tension between the antinomian female exclusivity and the limitations of patriarchal society, Howe's poetic form, juxtaposition, and intended thematic reversals are evident within the true copying of the text. So my rendition is actually a copy of her text, and I copied it exactly as how she had it to show the effect that true copying, as how proposes we read Emily Dickinson, is perceived. So Howe's poem starts with, in the first line, as if all history were a progress. Progress being the culture disseminated by the dominant white male discourse that is interrupted with the entrance of a female character in the second line who was coming to anoint him with, the third line, a single thread of narrative. The upside down topsy-turvy that reflects the disturbance and tension by the injection of the female character demonstrates the fragility of narrative. The female antinomianism shows the inclusion of female antinomianism shows their ability to interrupt the flow of, quote, headstrong anarchy thoughts in line 4. In the fifth line, the speaker reveals that in an actual world nothing ideal, strongly purports to claim that despite the male's headstrong domination, canonical reading is only one narrative in a world of fluidity, possibilities, and nothing ideal. Not only is meaning derived from the speaker's use of words, form adds to Howe's affective rhetorical choice that is translated on paper. Now, an example of editorial choice affecting the reading of literary text is exhibited in Franklin's 1998 rendition of Dickinson's poem Experience is the Angle Road, which is on the top left, alongside Howe's version typed directly from Dickinson's fascicle on the bottom left. I did say top left in the first one, right? Both juxtaposed next to a screenshot. I do apologize for the unclear copying of the text, but the screenshot drawn directly from the fascicle from the Emily Dickinson's archive. So both Franklin and Howe's texts contain the poems and letters that Dickinson used. However, in Dickinson's original manuscript, which Howe copies, line breaks emphasize the words that proceed from line breaks such as road, mind, complicate, and man. So second, fourth, and I can't count at the present moment, so they are in that. Suggesting that these line breaks emphasize words that proceed from line breaks such as road, mind, complicate, and man, suggesting independent connotative meanings by their very separation. The poem begins with suggesting that physical experience is a determinant that angles one's direction, and it exists within the paradox of the abstract mind as, quote, presuming it to lead. The physical form of the words road, mind, complicate, and man contribute to the angling of experience that is preferable to the abstractness of the mind, even though the hyphening of the word paradox connects these two concepts of natural and created to create natural paths for experience. However, the break in the second paragraph contradicts this natural course of experience by presenting man's individual agency called discipline as creating for itself its own man-made course that complicates the very experience of life by choosing to create for himself his pre-appointed pain. It is important to point out that this very contradiction can only be highlighted in the truest copying of one's text. Franklin's rendition reminds one of the, quote, quatrains of Protestant hymns that Dickinson protested with her writing, as it fails to highlight a key interruption that Dickinson inserted in her original writing, which we can see a little bit more clearly in Howe's rendition on the bottom left. In Howe's rendition of the manuscript, both the words mind and man are centered in each paragraph, true of the manuscript, and the centering of these words highlight this natural cycle of experience in contradiction with the man-made pre-appointment that constitutes different types of experience. Going back to editorial interferences, Franklin's rendition presents the poem more in alignment with the rules of formalism. In his introduction to the poems of Emily Dickinson, Franklin notes previous emendations that altered Dickinson's works and his attempts to correct the, quote, physical lineation, emendations that altered Dickinson's work, physical lineation, which includes word division, and of emendation to restore damaged text, correct slips of the pen, end quote. However, he confesses that, quote, if the orthography, capitalization, punctuation, and usage should seem problematical, they are nonetheless Dickinson's, not the editor's or the publisher's, end quote. This very rejection of authorial intent is what Howe argues as literary exclusion, where rather than accepting Dickinson's genius at face value, dominant literary structures step back from the openness of interpretation. In order to make Dickinson palatable, Franklin presents the conundrum of editorial work. One can either restore Dickinson's work to, quote, follow her private intentions and characteristics, or to lay onto the poem's social conventions and judgments that were not hers. Susan Howe's Susan Howe's critical look on publication practices and editorial interferences and its inability to capture intentionality in the truest sense of copying propelled her to, quote, trespass into the disciplines of American studies and textual criticism through my need to fathom what wildness and absolute freedom is in the nature of expression, end quote. Howe contends that Emily Dickinson, quote, restored the original clarity of each word skeleton. Dickinson lifted the load of European literary customs, end quote. Peter Nichols agrees. The brokenness of such writing, quote, I quote from Peter Nichols, Dickinson almost as much as Howe's seemed to defy syntactical regulation, end quote. Textual aesthetic transcends audience palatability, and Dickinson was freer to express her genius by writing outside the limits of social conventions. Editorial choices shape meaning, intent, and affect or effect of literary interpretations. Dickinson's experiment with unconventional structures reshaped the American editorial landscape. However, rather than reshaping her works to fit, However, her editors reshaped her works to fit canonical structures, to the palatability of the editor's audience rather than for the discovery of new horizons that allow for cultural experiences to merge with literary experience. While Dickinson threaded new literary landscapes, in recognizing and amending the gaps, variations, and erasures imposed by editorial choices that currently exist may be the next step toward an inclusive and pragmatic reading of a continually developing, reshaping American literature.